Operation Paperclip, when America recruited Nazi war criminals. How the United States whitewashed Nazi scientists and changed history. On a cold morning in September 1945, a group of German scientists stepped off a military transport at Boston Harbor. They were dressed in civilian clothes provided by the US Army, their hair neatly combed, their expressions carefully neutral. To casual observers, they might have been visiting professors or business consultants arriving for a lengthy stay. In reality, these men had spent the previous years designing weapons for Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. Rockets that had killed thousands of British civilians, jet fighters that had shot Allied pilots from the sky, and experimental technologies that pushed the boundaries of both science and human ethics. Their arrival marked the beginning of one of the most morally complex operations in American history, Operation Paperclip, a secret program that would eventually bring more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers and technicians to the United States. Some were relatively innocent technical experts who had worked for the Nazi regime simply because they had no other choice. Others were ardent Nazis, war criminals who had used slave labor, conducted brutal medical experiments, or participated directly in the Holocaust. The United States government recruited them all, falsified their backgrounds and gave them new lives in America, all in the name of winning the emerging Cold War against the Soviet Union. This is the story of how America made a devil's bargain, trading justice for scientific advantage, and how that decision shaped the world we live in today. To understand why the United States was willing to overlook war crimes and Nazi ideology, we must first appreciate what Germany had achieved scientifically during the Second World War. Despite losing the war militarily, Nazi Germany had made extraordinary advances in aerospace engineering, rocketry, jet propulsion, chemical weapons, and numerous other fields. In some areas, German technology was 5 to 10 years ahead of anything the Allies possessed. The crown jewel of German science was the V2 rocket program, developed at the Peenemünde research facility on the Baltic coast. The V2 was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, a technological marvel that could deliver a 1-ton warhead to targets over 200 miles away. It flew to the edge of space, reaching altitudes of 55 miles, before plummeting down on its target at supersonic speeds, giving defenders no warning and no chance to intercept it. Between September 1944 and March 1945, Germany launched over 3,000 V2 rockets at Allied targets, primarily London and Antwerp. These attacks killed approximately 9,000 people and injured countless more. The psychological impact was immense. The rockets arrived without warning, announced only by the thunderous explosion of their impact. There was no air raid siren, no time to seek shelter. Winston Churchill later said the V2 attacks were among the most terrifying aspects of the entire war. But the military impact, while significant, was not what made the V2 so important. What mattered was what it represented: the future of warfare. American and Soviet military planners immediately recognized that rocket technology could be adapted to carry atomic weapons across continents. Whoever mastered this technology first would dominate the post-war world. And the man who had created the V2 was a brilliant 33-year-old engineer named Wernher von Braun. Beyond rocketry, Germany had made advances in jet aircraft technology, producing the world's first operational jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262. German engineers had developed sophisticated submarines, infrared night vision equipment, advanced synthetic fuels and materials, and cutting-edge aerodynamics research. German pharmaceutical companies had pioneered new drugs and medical treatments, though some of this research had been conducted through horrific experiments on concentration camp prisoners. As Allied armies pushed into Germany in the final months of the war, a race began, not just to defeat the German military, but to capture these scientific assets before they fell into Soviet hands. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union all sent special teams ahead of regular troops to locate research facilities, seize documents, and secure German scientists. This scientific manhunt would determine who won the next war, the Cold War that everyone could see coming, even before Hitler's regime collapsed. No figure better embodies the moral complexities of Operation Paperclip than Wernher von Braun. Born into Prussian nobility in 1912, von Braun had been obsessed with space travel since childhood. As a teenager, he devoured science fiction novels by Jules Verne and Hermann Oberth, dreaming of rockets that could reach the moon and beyond. He studied physics and engineering, joining a group of amateur rocket enthusiasts while still in his 20s. Von Braun's brilliance was evident early. By age 25, he was technical director of Germany's rocket development program at Peenemünde, leading a team of thousands in developing increasingly sophisticated missiles. He was charming, articulate, and possessed of an almost messianic vision for space exploration. He saw rockets not as weapons but as vehicles to carry humanity to the stars. There was just one problem. To pursue his dream, von Braun had made accommodations with the Nazi regime. He joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and the SS in 1940, eventually reaching the rank of SS Sturmbannführer, roughly equivalent to a major. He later claimed these memberships were merely formalities required for his work, that he had no choice if he wanted to continue his research. Some historians accept this explanation, others are skeptical, noting that von Braun seemed to have few qualms about working closely with Heinrich Himmler and other top Nazi officials. More damningly, von Braun's rocket program relied heavily on slave labor. The underground Mittelwerk factory, where V-2 rockets were mass-produced, was one of the most horrific sights in the entire Nazi system. More than 60,000 concentration camp prisoners were forced to work there, laboring in brutal conditions in tunnels carved into a mountain. They worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, with minimal food, no medical care, and constant beatings from SS guards. The death rate was staggering. Estimates suggest that approximately 20,000 workers died at Mittelwerk, more than twice the number of people killed by the V-2 rockets themselves. Von Braun visited Mittelwerk regularly to oversee production. He toured the tunnels, consulted with managers, and witnessed the conditions firsthand. In his later life, he claimed he was unaware of the extent of the suffering, that he focused only on technical matters and had no authority over how workers were treated. But testimony from survivors contradicted this. Several witnesses recalled seeing von Braun at the factory, observing the brutal conditions without protest. One survivor testified that von Braun was present when prisoners were beaten for working too slowly. Despite this dark history, von Braun was exactly what the United States wanted. He was the world's leading rocket expert, he spoke English, and he was eager to work for whoever would fund his space dreams. When American troops advanced toward Peenemünde in May 1945, von Braun and his team arranged to surrender to the Americans rather than the Soviets. He had carefully calculated that the United States offered the best opportunity to continue his work. The initial American effort to recruit German scientists was called Operation Overcast, launched in July 1945. The goals were straightforward: bring German experts to the United States temporarily to share their knowledge, then send them back to Germany. The program was supposed to be limited in scope and duration, a quick knowledge transfer operation, nothing more. But reality quickly overtook these limited ambitions. American military and intelligence officials realized that simply interviewing the Germans and reading their documents wasn't enough. The technology was too complex, too dependent on tacit knowledge and practical experience. Moreover, if the scientists were sent back to Germany, they might end up working for the Soviets. The Cold War was already beginning, and the Soviet Union was conducting its own aggressive program to recruit German scientists. In November 1945, the Truman administration expanded and renamed the program. It became Operation Paperclip, allegedly named after the paperclips used to attach scientists' new falsified biographies to their files. The scope was dramatically increased. Instead of a temporary arrangement, the program would bring hundreds of Germans to America permanently, along with their families. This expansion created immediate problems. US immigration law explicitly barred Nazis and war criminals from entering the country. President Truman's directive authorizing Operation Paperclip included specific language stating that no person found by the commanding general to have been a member of the Nazi Party and more than a nominal participant in its activities or an active supporter of Nazi militarism could be brought to America. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, which ran Operation Paperclip, had a simple solution. They lied. JIOA officials systematically whitewashed the backgrounds of German scientists, creating sanitized dossiers that omitted Nazi Party membership, SS ranks, and involvement in war crimes. When the State Department or other agencies raised concerns about specific individuals, the JIOA simply rewrote their files, replacing damning information with vague or innocuous descriptions. The bureaucratic fraud was extensive and systematic. Scientists who had been ardent Nazis were described as apolitical or victims of coercion. SS officers became mere technical specialists. Those who had overseen slave labour were portrayed as having no knowledge of such matters. The deception was so thorough that even decades later, some of these falsified files remained in official records, obscuring the truth about who America had recruited. Between 1945 and the programme's official end in 1959, more than 1,600 German scientists and engineers came to America under Operation Paperclip, along with roughly 3,000 family members. They were dispersed to military bases, research facilities, and aerospace companies across the United States. The largest concentrations ended up at Fort Bliss in Texas, where the rocket team worked, and at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, where aircraft specialists were stationed. The most prominent group was von Braun's rocket team, 127 scientists and engineers who formed the core of America's emerging space program. They were initially stationed at Fort Bliss, living in barracks and working at the nearby White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. The irony was impossible to miss. These men who had helped build Hitler's vengeance weapons were now living comfortable lives in America, receiving good salaries and pursuing the research they loved, while millions of their victims had died in camps, cities destroyed by their rockets, or on battlefields. American authorities went to great lengths to make the Germans comfortable and productive. They were given substantial salaries, often more than equivalent American scientists earned. Their families were brought over and provided housing. They were shielded from prosecution and, in many cases, from public scrutiny. The government provided security to protect them from possible revenge attacks by Holocaust survivors or others who might recognize them. The Germans adapted to American life with varying degrees of success. Von Braun, ever the charmer, became an enthusiastic booster of his adopted homeland. He joined civic clubs, gave public lectures about space exploration, and cultivated relationships with military officials and politicians. He learned to navigate American bureaucracy and sold his vision of space travel with the same persuasive skill he'd once used to secure funding from the Nazi regime. Others remained more aloof, forming tight-knit German communities on military bases where they could speak their native language, eat familiar foods, and socialize primarily with each other. Some struggled with English and never fully integrated into American society. A few were tormented by guilt over their wartime activities, though most seemed remarkably able to rationalize or compartmentalize their pasts. While von Braun and his colleagues were settling into American life, the Nuremberg trials were prosecuting other Nazi war criminals. The contrast was stark and troubling. At Nuremberg, the Allied powers insisted that just following orders was not a defense for participation in war crimes. Nazi officials were held accountable for their actions, with many receiving death sentences or long prison terms. Yet, simultaneously, the United States was actively protecting German scientists who had overseen slave labor, conducted unethical experiments, or contributed directly to Nazi atrocities. The hypocrisy was glaring. America was prosecuting some Nazis while employing others, the deciding factor being not the severity of their crimes, but the value of their scientific knowledge. Some of the paperclip recruits had particularly disturbing backgrounds. Hubertus Strughold, known as the father of space medicine, had been a senior scientist in the Luftwaffe's medical research program. Evidence suggested he was present at a 1942 conference where Luftwaffe doctors discussed experiments conducted on Dachau prisoners, including lethal, high-altitude and freezing experiments. These experiments involved placing prisoners in pressure chambers until they died, or plunging them into ice water to study hypothermia. Research conducted with sadistic disregard for human suffering. After the war, Strughold denied any knowledge of these experiments. His files were sanitized by the JIOA, and he was brought to America, where he became a pioneer in aerospace medicine. He helped develop pressure suits, studied the effects of spaceflight on the human body, and trained astronauts. The Aeromedical Library at Brooks Air Force Base was named in his honor. For decades, his Nazi past remained hidden or ignored. Kurt Blomer was another troubling case. He had been a high-ranking Nazi physician who supervised medical experiments and was involved in biological warfare research. Blomer was actually tried at Nuremberg, but was acquitted, despite strong evidence of his involvement in plague experiments on concentration camp prisoners. Within 2 years of his acquittal, he was working for the US Army Chemical Corps, advising on biological warfare. Arthur Rudolph was von Braun's deputy and the production manager at Mittelwerk. Directly responsible for overseeing the slave labor force, he was intimately familiar with the brutal conditions and had authority to request more prisoners or approve punishments. After the war, he became a key figure in America's rocket program, eventually serving as project director for the Saturn V rocket that took astronauts to the moon. He received NASA's highest honor, the Distinguished Service Medal, before his past finally caught up with him in the 1980s. The decision to recruit these men represented a fundamental choice. America prioritized Cold War advantage over justice for Nazi victims. The rationale was that the Soviets were doing the same thing, which was true, and that America couldn't afford to let moral qualms hand technological superiority to the communists. But this logic had a troubling implication, that the importance of defeating communism justified allying with former Nazis and ignoring their crimes. America's moral compromise was not unique. The Soviet Union conducted its own aggressive program to recruit German scientists, though with characteristically different methods. While the Americans tried to entice scientists with good salaries and living conditions, the Soviets initially relied more on coercion. In October 1946, the Soviets conducted Operation Paperclip, a massive overnight roundup in which Red Army troops forcibly seized approximately 2,200 German specialists and their families, perhaps 6,000 people total, and transported them to the Soviet Union. Unlike the American program, which at least maintained a veneer of voluntarism, the Soviet operation was explicitly coercive. Scientists were given hours to pack before being loaded onto trains bound for the USSR. Once in the Soviet Union, German scientists worked under close supervision, often in closed cities where they were isolated from the broader Soviet population. Living conditions varied. Some were treated relatively well and given decent housing and supplies, while others endured harsh conditions reminiscent of the Gulag. The Soviets extracted as much knowledge as possible from the Germans, then gradually replaced them with Soviet scientists. By the mid-1950s, most German scientists had been sent back to East Germany, their usefulness exhausted. The Soviet program captured fewer of the top-tier scientists than Operation Paperclip. Von Braun and most of his inner circle had successfully surrendered to the Americans, but the Soviets did acquire substantial expertise, particularly in rocketry and jet propulsion. This knowledge contributed to the Soviet Union's surprisingly rapid development of ballistic missiles and, eventually, to their early successes in the space race. The existence of the Soviet program provided convenient justification for Operation Paperclip. American officials could argue that if the United States didn't recruit German scientists, the Soviets would get them instead. This framing cast the program as defensive necessity, rather than active choice to employ war criminals. But it was a self-serving argument that ignored a third option. Neither side had to recruit Nazis. Both superpowers could have agreed to prosecute war criminals and leave German scientists to rebuild their own country. That this option was never seriously considered reveals how quickly Cold War logic displaced the ideals that had supposedly motivated the fight against Hitler. Operation Paperclip was one of the most morally complex intelligence programs in modern history. Conceived in the aftermath of World War II, it brought more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, including many with Nazi affiliations, to the United States. Among them was Wernher von Braun, whose expertise in rocketry helped create the V-2 missile that devastated Europe. Under Paperclip, von Braun and his team became central to America's missile and space programs, developing the Redstone, Jupiter, and Saturn rockets that powered both the Cold War arsenal and the Apollo moon missions. Von Braun's work culminated in the Saturn V rocket, which launched Apollo 11 in 1969 and carried humanity to the moon. The achievement transformed him into an American hero, admired, televised, and celebrated. Yet his past at the Mittelwerk facility, where slave labourers died producing V-2 missiles, was erased from public memory. Operation Paperclip had fulfilled its purpose, turning Nazi scientists into symbols of American triumph while concealing their crimes. For decades, the program remained classified. Only in the 1980s did investigative journalists and historians expose the darker truths: falsified background checks, sanitized records, and direct US complicity in protecting known war criminals. Cases like that of Arthur Rudolph, who was found to have overseen slave labour and later renounced his citizenship, shattered the myth of innocent scientists simply following orders. Similar revelations emerged about Hubertus Strughold and Kurt Blomer, whose wartime medical experiments had been whitewashed. Defenders of Paperclip argue that it was a necessary evil, an act of Cold War survival. They claim that without German expertise, the Soviet Union might have achieved nuclear and space dominance. Others insist that many of these men had little choice under Nazi rule, and that their post-war work advanced science, space exploration, and nuclear deterrence that helped prevent global war. Critics counter that this reasoning collapses under moral scrutiny. By employing Nazis, the United States betrayed the principles it had championed at Nuremberg, that individuals are responsible for their actions, and that crimes against humanity cannot be excused by convenience or skill. The program set a precedent for secrecy, deception, and moral compromise within US intelligence, habits that would later echo in scandals like Watergate and Iran-Contra. Most Paperclip scientists died comfortably in America, never facing justice. Von Braun himself passed away in 1977, Still revered, his legacy split between genius and guilt. Operation Paperclip remains a cautionary tale, a reminder that scientific progress built on atrocity carries a permanent stain. Its true legacy lies not only in rockets or the moon landing, but in the enduring question it poses: how far should a nation go in the name of security and progress? And what does it lose when it trades morality for power?